Senate Bill 1165, a bill relating to abolition of the death penalty.
Senator from Eastern Fairfax, Senator Surovell.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move the bill pass. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the bill that basically abolishes capital punishment in Virginia. I'm going to just walk you through the bill really quick, and then I'm going to tell you why you should vote for it. First of all, the bill redefines capital murder as being aggravated murder. It defines every aggravated murder as being a Class 1 felony, requires a judge to sentence every person convicted of aggravated murder to life in prison. The judge is then allowed to, if they want to, suspend some or none of that sentence, except in the case of murder, or aggravated murder of a law enforcement officer. The bill cleans up our code, eliminates any references to lethal injection, some of the secrecy laws we passed on that before. It also provides that anybody who is currently in prison who received the death penalty, their sentence is commuted to life in prison without parole, earned sentence credit, or geriatric parole. That's basically what the bill does. Mr. President, since our colony was founded, 1,389 people have been executed by our government in this state, more than any other governmental entity in the United States of America. The first execution in the New World that was done by Europeans, at least, was in 1608 at Jamestown. Captain George Kendall, he was shot for treason. Since capital punishment was reinstated, we've had about nearly 1,000 people executed in the country. Virginia has been number 2, only to Texas, since capital punishment was reinstated after Furman versus Georgia. Today, there's two, again, as I said, 2 men on death row. But Virginia has not seen a jury impose a capital punishment sentence or death penalty sentence since 2011. From my perspective, there's, I think, 6 sort of categories of problems with capital punishment as it's administered today. First of all, there's been 174 people that have been exonerated after they received a death sentence. A lot of this has to do with the advent of DNA technology. I'm sure other technology will come along, but I believe it's estimated that for about every 10 death sentences that are rendered, 1 innocent person is convicted. That ought to just give you chills to think of the thousands of people in America who've been executed. How many of them were actually innocent, given those odds today and how things used to operate back in the day? But I cannot think of anything that's more awful, unspeakable, and wrong for a government to do than to use its power to execute somebody who didn't commit the crime they're accused of. The problem with capital punishment is that once it's inflicted, you can't take it back. It can't be corrected. It's the only punishment that we render that we can't correct for in some way. It's not something the money can solve because the person's already dead. Mr. President, the next thing I would note is that I don't think it's possible to have a fair trial today in our current environment when capital punishment's in play. Nationally, according to Gallup, 60% of Americans believe that life in prison is a better sentence than capital punishment when it comes to murder. You all may have seen the Wasson poll last week that polled Virginians that said 55%, I think it was, maybe 58% of Virginians are now opposed to capital punishment. And just so you understand how it works, if you're sitting in a jury pool and one of the questions you get asked in a jury pool if it's a capital punishment case is, are you opposed to capital punishment? If you raise your hand, you're thrown off the jury. And one of the things our colony, now our state, led the world in was the adoption of a Declaration of Rights. It was one of the first things we did. My sort of constituent, George Mason, wrote the Virginia Declaration of Rights. And one of those rights is that you have a right to a trial of jury by your peers. When 58% of your peers are disqualified from serving on your jury, it's kind of hard to get a trial of jury by your peers. And in fact, what that ends up forcing is a selection of jurors that are not representative of your community. I mean, back in the day when maybe 10 or 20% of the public was opposed to capital punishment, maybe a little bit different. But today, when over half of America, half of our state, most Americans are opposed to this, I don't know how you can get a fair jury trial on that issue anymore. It's basically become impossible because public opinion has changed. It's changed a lot in the last 10 years. The next thing I'd say, the third issue I'd think, is we ought to look at who we stand with today. Ask yourself, what other countries are still doing this? There's not a single other Western industrialized nation that's doing it. The country that leads the world, as far as we know, in executions is China. But we don't really know how many. We just know they do a lot, over 1,000. Next in line comes Iran. After that is Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, and then the USA. Right after us is Pakistan, and right on Pakistan's heels is Somalia. And if we'd had this discussion, 7, 8 years ago, we'd be standing there strong with ISIS. These are the countries that are still engaging in this practice. From my perspective, these are not the kinds of countries that we aspire to, both as a state and as a country. This is not a practice that we, I think, expect the rest of the world to emulate. When we think of America as being the beacon of hope and freedom that it is, and we ask other countries in the world to look at how we adjudicate our people, and we look at how we treat other people in our society, this is not something to be proud of. And I think that Virginia can restore its leadership role in this state by being what will be, I think, the 23rd state in the country to eliminate this practice. Fourth issue, set of issues, has to do with equity. There is an indisputable connection between the death penalty and racial oppression. And that is impossible to deny. All you got to do is look at the statistics. You're much more likely to receive a death sentence if you kill somebody who's white and you're not. You're much more likely to get it if you're poor, if you're mentally disabled. You're much more likely to get it if you have a diminished IQ. You're much more likely to get it if you have a brain injury. This is, the folks who end up commit murders often have different sorts of problems. Those problems put them in certain economic circumstances, and those things collectively often result in people getting a sentence that if they had the resources to defend themselves, they probably wouldn't get the death penalty. And that's also largely why now that the state has actually finally begun to invest resources in a capital defender service, you haven't seen a death penalty rendered in Virginia now in nearly a decade. Because once you give people good lawyers and you give jurors the information they need to make a decision, jurors suddenly realize that the death penalty, even people who are all pro-death penalty, look at these people and their circumstances and decide it's not really a fair outcome. Fifth set of issues I'd ask you to consider is how expensive this is. So the fiscal impact statement on this bill always drives me absolutely crazy. Every year I put this in, now I guess 2 years in a row I put this in, the fiscal impact statement comes back and says that by eliminating the death penalty it will cost taxpayers $77,000. Because instead of killing somebody, we have to buy their food. And the $77,000 number, by the way, assumes, that's the average cost of a prisoner, but you don't have to shut down a prison to house these people, right? So the actual cost to not execute somebody is probably the cost of their food and maybe a little bit of electricity and some water or something. But in any event, I don't even buy the $77,000. But what that impact statement always leaves out is the $3.9 million a year we spend on the Capital Defender Service, which is spent to fight these kinds of cases. And the Capitol Defender Service budget doesn't include the costs we spend for police officers who have to spend a lot of extra time in these cases, detectives, prosecutors. It doesn't cover the cost of expert witnesses that are retained for trial. You have substantial, massive expert witness costs in these cases when they go to trial. Time spent by jurors, by the clerk, by courts. None of that's included. And it's a lot of money. And I would just think that even if you assume the fiscal impact statement's correct, that we're going to spend $700,000 over 10 years to house these people instead of executing them. That's a lot cheaper than spending what is probably close to $40 million to have that option available over 10 years. And just think for a second what we could do with $40 million over 10 years and the difference that could make in Virginians' lives versus spending it to have this option available, which juries never use anymore. So just think about that as we allocate resources, part of what we have to do here. But it doesn't make sense from that point of view. And the last set of issues, Mr. President, what I would point out is that it has become virtually impossible to administer this sentence today, given what I think all of us aspire to in the traditions of our government in terms of openness. You know, we adopted the Freedom of Information Act. I'm sure the senior senator from Fairfax can give me the date, but we try to do everything in our government as open as possible, subject to sunshine. You know, Justice Louis Brandeis said that a stoplight, a street light, is the most effective policeman, and sunshine is the best disinfectant. And that's something I've always felt about when you're talking about the government spending taxpayer dollars and doing government business. Sunshine produces better results. In order for us to continue to do lethal injection, we've had to turn our sunshine laws on their head in order to continue this practice, because all the companies that manufacture the ingredients that allow us to snuff out a human life won't sell us the drugs anymore. And so we've had to resort to using compounding pharmacies that don't want their identity revealed because they're breaking their contracts with their European manufacturers. So now we have to hide everything from the public. And from my perspective, if there's any act that requires full and complete sunshine, disclosure, and information, it's putting out a human life. So this system we have has just become completely untenable. It just doesn't work anymore. And it's time to move on. Mr. President, you know, we've been heading in this direction for a while now. The United States Supreme Court in 1987 said for the second or third time that a death sentence cannot be mandatory on a jury. We can't mandate it. The legislature can't make it a mandatory minimum sentence. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court said that we cannot impose a death sentence on anybody who's intellectually disabled. 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court said that it's no longer consistent with the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment prohibition to execute children. 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court said that we cannot use the death penalty as a punishment for crimes that do not involve a homicide. 2019, the U.S. Supreme Court said we cannot execute people suffering from dementia. It's just a matter of time, folks. And from my perspective, it's time that we move on. There's a dwindling number of states that do this, a dwindling number of countries that do it. Public opinion is now in support of abolishing capital punishment. Mr. President, I think it's time that we stand with the majority of Virginians now and all Americans, and we move on from this. Please vote green on this.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the senator from Hampton, Senator Locke, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise in support of Senate Bill 1165.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Equal Justice Initiative is a nonprofit organization in Montgomery, Alabama, founded and directed by attorney Brian Stevenson. The EJI provides legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails and prisons. EJI strongly challenges the death penalty and excessive punishment. In perusing EJI's website, Mr. President, I was struck by one of the videos that was posted. It stated, "The death penalty is lynching's stepchild." EJI researchers have documented 4,075 racial terror lynchings of African Americans in several states between 1877 and 1950, including those that were done in Virginia. The lynching of African Americans was terrorism, a widely supported phenomenon used to enforce racial insubordination and segregation. This was not frontier justice carried out by a few marginalized vigilantes or extremists. Instead, many African Americans who were never accused of any crime were tortured and murdered in front of picnicking spectators, including elected officials and prominent citizens, for bumping into a white person or wearing their military uniforms after World War I, or not using the appropriate title when addressing a white person. People who participated in lynching were celebrated and acted with impunity. Lynching profoundly impacted race relations in this country and shaped the contemporary geographic, political, social, and economic conditions of African Americans. Most importantly, lynching reinforced a narrative of racial difference and legacy of racial inequality that is readily apparent in our criminal justice system today. Mass incarceration, racially biased capital punishment, excessive sentencing, disproportionate sentencing of racial minorities, and police abuse of people of color reveal problems in American society that were shaped by the terror era. And lynchings were the precursor of the death penalty. In the 1940s and 1950s, they simply moved from outside to the inside. Legal violence instead of vigilante justice. It is not lost on anyone that those states that had a high number of lynchings correlate with their support of the death penalty, including here in Virginia. Mr. President, I close with two other messages from EJI. One from the website itself and one from its founder, Bryan Stevenson. From the EJI website, it states, "The question we need to ask about the death penalty in America is not whether someone deserves to die for a crime. The question is whether we deserve to kill." From Mr. Stevenson himself, and I quote, "Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done." End of quote. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. For what purpose does the senator from Rockingham, Senator Obenshain, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, members of the Senate, I rise in opposition to this bill. And let me be clear. I am pro-life. I do believe in the sanctity of human life. I do believe that the death penalty should be reserved for only the worst of the worst cases. I believe in the protection of innocent human life more than anything. There are clearly cases in which capital punishment is an appropriate sanction. I would never make many of the arguments that were listed in the speeches in favor of this bill in defense of capital punishment. I would never make an economic argument in support of the retention of capital punishment. I would never make a robust defense over the manner in which capital punishment was applied in centuries past. But I would point out a few things. The sunshine argument I find that a clever turn, and I salute my colleague from Eastern Fairfax for the manner in which that's been cast. But in fact, the sunshine argument is an argument which is made by many in an insincere fashion, because the sunshine laws have indeed been changed by opponents of capital punishment for the specific purpose of using that sunshine in order to target companies, drug companies, and others who unknowingly, in many cases, have provided the drugs for use in the application of capital punishment. And it is not something that is making fair application of capital punishment possible in those rare instances in which it is deemed appropriate. I think that the senator from Eastern Fairfax makes an important point when he points out that very seldom is capital punishment even requested now. And even less seldom is it given by juries. And that is not because there are not cases in which capital punishment is appropriate, but it is because of the discernment of prosecutors and law enforcement officers and members of juries in connection with how they believe that capital punishment should be applied. And they believe, as most of us do, that it should rarely, if ever, be applied. And indeed, that is the case. It's been argued that I don't think it's possible to have a fair trial in a capital case. Well, there are a lot of people who don't like the death penalty, would like to see it repealed, but that doesn't disqualify one from service on a capital jury. The question is, if the law and the evidence supports the application of a capital sentence, would you be able to do it? And if the answer to that is yes, notwithstanding your personal beliefs, then you can serve on that jury. And you know what? If I'm a defense lawyer, I'd want somebody on that jury who would say, I'm opposed personally to capital punishment, but in the appropriate circumstance, I could vote for it. I would want that person on that jury. You know, we had a governor not too long ago, Governor Tim Kaine, who has been very outspoken in his personal belief that the death penalty is wrong. But when he was running for governor, he said, notwithstanding that personal belief, I could apply it in the appropriate circumstance. And indeed, when governor, he did allow death sentences to be carried out. It is one of the most agonizing decisions, I'm sure, that Senator, then Governor Kaine, ever had to make. And those decisions are no less easy for people who serve on jury, whether they are supporters of capital punishment as a concept in those rare cases or not. I believe that capital sanctions can be fairly applied in Virginia today. I think that it is important not to look at the way that capital punishment was applied in the 17th and 18th century, even the 19th century, or even the 20th century, much of it. But I think what we need to do is look at how it's being applied now. And it is rare. It is reserved for the worst of the worst. Ivan Telugus. Ivan Telugus was convicted of capital murder for the 2001 murder for hire of his girlfriend in Harrisonburg. He paid $2,000 to somebody who entered his girlfriend's home. She was in the bathroom, in a bath. He slit her throat and left her there. She was found 2 days later by her mother in a blood-filled bathtub with her 21-month-old toddler in the bathroom with her, who'd been there for 2 days while his mother lay dead in the bathtub. Ivan Telugus was convicted of capital murder. That sentence was actually commuted. But Ivan Telugus fits my definition of the worst of the worst. Ricky Gray was convicted following the January 2006 7-day murder spree in the city of Richmond. Over that 7-day period, Mr. Gray and one of his friends murdered 7 people over a 7-day period, the last of which was a home entry into the home in Richmond of the Harvey family. They took this family of 4 into the basement. They bound them, they tortured them, and they savagely murdered all 4 members of the family, including the 4-year-old and the 9-year-old daughters of the Harvey family. These are savage crimes. These are the worst of the worst. These are not crimes that are picked by prosecutors across Virginia on a daily basis to prosecute as capital crimes. I believe in the rare application of capital punishment. I do not believe that this bill is an appropriate response to misapplications of capital punishment of decades and centuries past. I think that the senator from Eastern Fairfax is entirely right, that the attitudes, the beliefs of our community, of our Commonwealth, of the people across Virginia have dramatically changed. I believe in our American system of justice. I believe that we are better now than we've ever been. And I believe that with the application of DNA evidence, I believe with the years of appeals and the opportunities for clemency and executive action to avoid misapplication of justice in questionable cases, that capital punishment can be fairly applied. And I believe that it is improvident, I believe it is wrong to repeal capital punishment for the stated reasons.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the junior senator from Chesterfield, Senator Chase, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak against Senate Bill 1165.
Senator, has the floor.
Mr. President, one of the things that really concerns me the most is justice for the victim. And while I too am 100% pro-innocent life and the sanctity of life, I have friends who have brothers, a brother who was murdered in cold blood and released this past year by the parole board. A parole board who actually released a man, Donald Lee Brooks, who was charged with second-degree murder of Gerald Hall, who committed a crime in 2010. He was shot multiple times in the back. kicked over, shot again, sentenced to 28 years and only served 10. Mr. President, if I had to ask my friend Ruth about where she would stand on the death penalty, especially in light of this past year when the parole board time and time and time again released murderers into the streets of Virginia. I will tell you that they will clearly advocate for the death penalty so once and for all justice can be served, and a man who was responsible for the death of my friend's brother could never be released. One of the comments made is, once the person receives the death penalty, it's permanent. What about the victim? What about the victim? What about the brother of my friend who will never get to spend time with family and with their kids? What about the victim? I believe, too, that this should be rare and reserved for the worst of the events. But, Mr. President, in light of this past year, I have to ask, who do we support more? The victim or the killer? Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose does Senator from King George, Senator Stewart, rise?
Speak to the bill, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, members of the body, this is probably one of the hardest things that we ever have to debate or vote on if you really take this to heart, and I concur with what the gentleman from Fairfax City said in almost all respects, and the gentlelady from Hampton. Putting innocent people to death and the atrocities that have occurred in our past are horrific, and we should never let that happen again. But the fact of the matter is, getting the death penalty now has become a much less occurrence. And I firmly believe that 10 guilty people should go free before one innocent person should be put to death. And I think our system of justice should reflect that. But I have to share a personal story, because as you debate this and think about it in your mind, I started thinking about this story the day we were watching the inauguration. Wonderful, happy event for President Biden and Vice President Harris. And my daughter had a friend, a young Marine. His name was Davis Mosqueda. And Davis was 20 years old, and he was a part of the elite silent drill team for the Marine Corps that's stationed in Washington, D.C. And the last time I talked to him, he was so excited about being in the inauguration for the President and the Vice President. He'd only been in the Marine Corps for 2 years. That's all he'd ever wanted to do. He joined the Marines right out of high school, just been promoted to Lance Corporal and the Assistant Drill Master of this very elite drill team. In all respects, a model Marine, in all respects, a good boy, never been in any trouble. All he ever wanted to do was serve his country. That's all he ever wanted to do. So they had a little bit of liberty, and he was looking so forward to going home, and he had a 7-year-old sister, and she had missed him so much, so he went home and was able to spend some time, and he was looking forward to coming back to participating in the inauguration, and he was able to go see some of his high school friends. And as they were doing what young people do, there was a friend there who had a boyfriend who did not have a good background, and he was calling her, and I don't know the whole circumstances, but the girl walked out from the group of friends and went outside to talk to the boyfriend and was gone a long time. And this young Marine decided he should go check on her because he knew that they were having some difficulties. As he stepped outside, this guy took a 9mm and he shot him in the chest 3 times. He took that mother's son away. He took that father's son away, and he took everything away that Davis Mosqueda would ever have or ever did have. And he walked away. And I tell you, standing on the floor of the Senate today, there are some people so rotten to the core, that you can't do anything with them, and you have to protect other members of society from them. That is our responsibility, to do that. There are cases when this is entirely appropriate, and we have the responsibility to preserve this punishment for those that are so bad. They would take a human life just out of pure meanness and rottenness. We all want to be compassionate, but there's some people who don't deserve our compassion. They simply do not deserve our compassion. And that is one of the best examples I can think of. That young man didn't get to go back to the inauguration with his drill team because that person was so rotten, he shot him for no other reason than meanness.
What purpose does the Senator from Northwestern Fairfax, Senator Boysko, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator, has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have a lot of compassion for the people who have suffered with family members who have been killed. But killing another person is not going to bring them back. In fact, I've heard actually from victims' families when these issues have come up over the past few years. And I remember one daughter of a man who had been murdered who was imploring that we abolish the death penalty. That she said, this isn't going to bring my dad back. It's not going to change anything. It's just going to continue more pain for more people. And I think that the senator from Eastern Fairfax laid out all the facts so well. And the senator from Hampton, I'm so pleased that she referred to Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative. That's certainly something that I care a lot about. But I had one of my constituents sent me a quote, and she's a veteran, and I feel it's so timely and so appropriate for this specific issue as we discuss abolishing the death penalty. It's from Thomas Jefferson, and it says, I am not an advocate for frequent changes in the law and constitutions, but the laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and manners and opinions change, with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also to keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when a boy, as civilized society to remain ever under the regime of their barbarous ancestors. And I think that fits the conversation that we're having today. We have ways of keeping society safe by keeping those who are most dangerous in prison for life with no opportunity for leaving. We know that we have judges that this body and our counterparts in the House of Delegates appoint who are responsible and thoughtful and working hard to protect the best interests of the Commonwealth. And I believe that the time has come for us to do a brave thing, to do what's right and just, and to abolish the death penalty. And I urge the body to support the Eastern Fairfax Senators' bill today. Thank you.
For what purpose does the senator from Henrico, Senator Donovan, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to ask the patron a question first and then speak to the bill.
Senator, yield for a question.
I'll yield.
Thank you,
Senator Yields, you have the
Mr.
floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. And the senator from Eastern Fairfax County, I am curious. I want to make sure I understand the statistic you offered about, was it the number of Virginians that are opposed to the death penalty, the number of Virginians who want it repealed?
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would say there was a poll that the Watson Center did, I believe it was last week, and I don't remember exactly how the question was phrased. If you gave me 60 seconds, I could figure it out, but my recollection was that it was 58% of Virginians either didn't support capital punishment or wanted it repealed. I'm not sure which.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the senator.
Speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I would have to say I come from a family of law enforcement and military, and I've long been pro-life since Roe versus Wade was passed, and I've always struggled with the death penalty because of the conflict between that value of being pro-life, and that really applies everywhere. It's not a quality measurement of life. You either support life or not. And I have to tell you, I came to the General Assembly this year very open-minded about considering revoking the death penalty, and I remain that way. However, the devil's in the details. And as I look, when I heard that statistic, I started looking for facts and statistics and polls and surveys. And I need to say that I wasn't able to find that Watson poll, but I found other polls that are actually listed on the death penalty information site. And it says specifically, first of all, it says that 56% of Americans still support the death penalty based on, in regards to capital murder. But most importantly, I think we all know about polls, and we all know how questions are phrased. This is what it says. 60% of Americans now say life without the possibility of parole is a better penalty than the death penalty. I would count myself in their numbers, Mr. President. And I have to say, you can't take a data point and apply it to a different piece of data. That's to be true to what that value assessment was. And I believe there is a balance between the right thing, which I don't think it's right to murder somebody, no matter how egregiously they've behaved. But you must provide to society a sense of justice. And to family members who now imagine that somebody who murders their child or their brother or their wife or their father, I strongly feel, based on this poll, not that I make my decisions on polls, but they inform me, I strongly believe, based on this poll, that what you are doing today is not what Virginians or the American people want, and it frustrates me because we had the chance to do that yesterday. So make no mistake, this is not what the majority of Americans support, because we failed to make the right decisions yesterday. And that frustrates me because I want to find a way to weave my path through the complexity of my moral principles and the law as we apply it, and really speaking on behalf of my constituents. And I think that a law that did that made sure that we took away the death penalty without ever having the possibility of parole would allow me to accomplish that. But as it is, I'm not able to support this bill. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose does the senator from Arlington, Senator Favola, rise?
Speaking to the measure, Mr. President.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to say, we need to view this bill as in the context of a sentencing bill. I'm speaking in favor of this abolition of the death penalty for some public health reasons. The ACLU and the National Academies, both of those organizations have done research on whether the death penalty is a deterrent, and it actually is not a deterrent. In fact, the states that have abolished the death penalty have murder rates that are lower, consistently lower. So when we're looking at our criminal justice system, we should be trying to shape a system that gives us the public policy goals we want to achieve. And one of those goals, I think, should be deterrence. And actually, life in prison without parole is considered to be a deterrent, as a senator from Henrico mentioned. And we also have to think about how we can apply these sentences in the fairest and the most just manner. And as we've heard, mistakes happen. No matter what system we devise, we will not devise a perfect justice system. There will always be the possibility that we could execute somebody who was innocent. And as a state official, I don't think the state should ever be in that position. I don't think the state should be in a position of executing anybody. As a senator from Eastern Fairfax mentioned, it's an action we can never take back. And for those of my colleagues who've always argued for limited government, I would think you would want to support abolishing the death penalty, because this is one of the gravest and most severe actions a government can take. I do hope this body will pass this measure. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose is the junior senator from Virginia Beach, Senator Kiggins, rise?
Mr. President, I rise to speak to the bill.
Senator's floor.
Mr. President, I really, really want to vote yes to this bill, but I can't, and there's a few reasons why, and I never thought I would say this, but I actually agreed with many of the things that the senator from Eastern Fairfax said. I agree with a lot of the things he said, actually. But I also heard the things that the senator from Rockingham said, and the senator from Franklin, and the senator from King George all said as well. And I have to align with them, and the Senator Donovan as well. I'm an advocate for life at all stages, and from conception to natural death. I think it's hypocritical to be any other way. And the senator from Franklin said that yesterday in a very eloquent speech. But I can imagine, the wonder of conception. But I have been there as a hospice nurse for the natural death of many, many people, and there's definitely good ways to die, and I've seen those, and I've held those patients' hands, and it's amazing to be in the room when God works that way. So I absolutely support, life at all stages, and like the senator from Franklin said, life means life, and for me, that's what it means at all times. So I don't like the death penalty. I never have. I've never been supportive of it. I would love to vote for this bill. But I've heard the stories that a lot of our very eloquent lawyers have told us. They're challenging to listen to. I sat in on subcommittee when we had other family members speak who were victims. The woman whose ex-husband let her out in the yard, shot her in the stomach 3 times in front of her 2 children. She was my age. She had the same color hair as I did. I can only imagine what that woman went through. And listening to her talk about the PTSD for her children who were small, their suicide attempts, it's really, really gut-wrenching. So those are the people that I respect, their life as well, the life of the victims. So again, just to be consistent with life from conception to natural death, I support it. But I'm also supportive and care about the life of those victims. I believe that life in prison is a worse punishment than the death penalty. So the substitute that was offered yesterday from the senator from Franklin, I would have voted for that. I think that's a place that maybe we could have found some more, I wish we could have found some more agreement in. I think that's what the senator from, Senator Donovan said about the polls she mentioned. I think that's where many, many Americans are at. I've heard it stated on this floor when we talk about criminal justice reform, where's the empathy? That was a quote. One of my defense mechanisms, just being in this room, is writing quotes down that you all say. And that was a quote. I remember I heard, where is the empathy? Well, the empathy for me, and I asked that about the victims. Where is the empathy from the victims, for the victims? We've heard so many changes in our criminal justice system, and I'm not a lawyer, so I learn a lot and I listen to you all day in and day out, but almost not a day goes by where we don't change a portion of how we are judging people that don't follow our laws and that do heinous crimes, many of which we have discussed in this room. Getting rid of mandatory minimums, changes in our bail we talked about the other day, our jury sentencing, the geriatric and disability parole, just trying to bring back parole in general. There's so many changes that are happening. If it hadn't been for all those changes, I might have been supportive of this. And again, I'm a defender of life, advocate for life. I do not want the death penalty. But I also don't like all these changes that we've made in our criminal justice system so that we can't ensure that the lives of the victims are going to be respected as well. Yesterday, the senator from Lynchburg mentioned a U.S. News and World Report about how safe we were as a state. And I'm a mom of 4 kids, and I live in a neighborhood in suburbia, and I worry about safety in our communities. And he said, he's curious to see where that report goes in 4 years. And I am as well. I worry where our priorities are at. I want to support law enforcement. I want to see better mental health treatment for people that end up in jails. I want to see better transparency for our parole boards. I want to keep people out of jail so we don't have to have these discussions. Safer communities, jobs for everyone. These are the things that I want. I wish I could vote for this bill, but because of the victims, I cannot. Thank you, Mr. President.
What purpose does the senator from Franklin County, Senator Stanley, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speak to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members of the body, it's a true honor to serve here. We come together based on our principles and our ideals and what we need to accomplish, not just for the people that we serve, but also because our ideals align with the people that we serve. And then when we come to this body and our ideals may be different, our goals usually are the same in what we want to accomplish, just different ways and different measures on how those goals could be accomplished. That's when we forge compromise. That's when we do things that the press reports as bipartisan. Principles matter. And this is yet another time that I've stood on this floor and professed my principles to you of why I'm opposed to the death penalty. And they've been articulated by others today, but it is my faith, my belief in life, that God has given us the wonderful gift. My father, before he passed away, he's the one that instilled me with these principles. He said, son, what's really going to matter, and what God is going to ask you at the time, is what did you do with the gift of life that I gave you? It's that gift of life given by God. And also then the power of death, which is God's power. Because I strongly believe that vengeance is not mine. It is for God to decide. And I certainly don't believe that a government should have that awesome power of God. Remember Franklin, and I'm paraphrasing, and I don't have the exact quote, but Franklin said, government's ultimate aim is that it is the highest authority over the people that it rules, that there is nothing higher. The beauty of this democracy and even the religious freedom that we have is that government must understand, for those believers, that there is a higher authority, that it is not the highest authority in the land, not in our hearts or our minds or our souls. And the power that it wields when it wields the ultimate penalty of death, even for those who have committed heinous crimes, is an act of vengeance. For us humans, because we are frail, imperfect, feels good, if but only for a moment. But it solves nothing. It solves nothing except a lust for vengeance, which in my mind is a sin. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, not ours to have. And yes, we have evolved as human beings through civilizations and societies to the point, if we dial back 500 to 1,000 years, we were much more barbaric people. I was reading Captain Kendall when the senator from Eastern Fairfax was talking about the first execution in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And the offenses that you could have been executed after he was executed as being a spy, were included stealing a chicken. We call it petty larceny right now. Fraternizing with the Indians. And people were routinely put to death. And the only dignity was if you were someone of high character or class, you didn't get hanged, you got shot. So even as far back as the beginning of our nation, as the senator from Eastern Fairfax says, we were coming out of a barbaric age in terms of how we treated life and death. Clearly, other things and other decisions they made at the time reflect that they were not matured in their thinking. We had not brought ourselves to the point where we're thinking the way we're thinking now. And someone said today on this floor, and those that may oppose the death penalty, who do we support more, the victim or the killer? I support justice. And supporting justice is supporting the victim of the crime, the victim's family of the crime, but also making sure that the system works and is right and does not make mistakes. That's why I proposed life without parole. If you're convicted of the aggravated murder, life without parole means life without parole, you're never going to see the light of day. If you're convicted. It also doesn't kill somebody who then turns out to be innocent, because it does happen. It happens a lot, more than you think. We've talked about that before. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry. The current bill in its current form provides for the ability of someone who kills under the special circumstances, which we know is the special circumstances of capital murder, which would now be aggravated murder, to be potentially set free at some point later in life. Because it gives the power to the judges. And then I've heard again on the floor, we should trust our judges. Well, I sit on this floor every day and I see people wanting to yank off their judges here, yank off their judges there, because they're not acting the way that we think they should be acting, which injects politics into it. Because those judges are reliant upon us to reappoint them. Would they be afraid that a sentence of life without parole in an aggravated case might bring the ire of one of you, so that when they come up for reappointment, you wag your finger at them and say, I didn't like that sentence you gave. You should have given them the opportunity for parole. So I'm not going to reappoint you, because they're human beings. They're frail too. They're imperfect. That's why the system is imperfect. The lawyers, like myself, we're imperfect. Me less often than the rest of you. But that imperfection creates an imperfect system. And so when we give that ability in an aggravated murder situation to a judge to sentence someone below life without the possibility of parole, then that imperfection is pervasive on both sides and doesn't protect the victim nor the victim's family. Let me ask you a question. If there was a person who is clearly proven beyond a reasonable doubt of the willful, deliberate, premeditated killing of a citizen of the Commonwealth during the commission of an abduction, after they had abducted them, and they had abducted them with the intent to defile that person, do you want them ever to see the light of day if they're convicted? Because the bill in its current form allows that. The potential of that is there. God, let's hope that there's a judge out there that says life without parole in that instance, but it's not for certain. That's why the substitute said life without parole means life without parole. Because also, too, if it turns out it was wrong, DNA evidence or some kind of other evidence exonerates them, then the government hasn't made the mistake that it can't take back, killing an innocent life. But do you think somebody like that should be let go when they abduct someone with the intent to defile a child or anything like that? Murder for hire, you think somebody who does that should be let go? Anybody who kills a police officer, that's in there. You're okay with that. But what if they do multiple killings in the same transaction? Kill a whole family. You trust that judge enough that you sometimes like on the bench and sometimes want to remove on the bench, not to give any other sentence but life without parole? I don't. I don't. And you know, ladies and gentlemen, I've said it before and I'll say it again, governments have gotten it wrong. That's why, and one of the reasons why I think not just myself, but other Republicans sitting on this side of the aisle were prepared to support and work together to abolish the death penalty if you would have worked with us. We weren't asking too much. Somebody kills with special circumstances that we're listing here, life without parole. No chance of freedom. Nope, 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 nope. Because we're moving in a way now where we're doing away with all mandatory minimums. Nope, nope, our way of the highway. Nope, 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 nope. Can we have some input? Nope. Inconsistent with our other thing. And I'm one of those guys that believes that, okay, some mandatory minimums do need to go away, but some don't. Can we have some input on that? Nope. We want to get it right. We want to work with you on this. This could have been coming out today as a bipartisan effort to end the death penalty in Virginia. Instead, it's a party line effort. And you know, that old phrase, temper justice with mercy, that's how we administer it here in America, means bringing justice to those victims and victims' families, but at the same time being merciful because we're human beings. We must always remember that in our criminal justice system. But I don't understand why on the other side, and the author of this bill, where I am on this bill as a named co-patron, seems to think that life without parole doesn't fit within the definition of mercy, when the mercy was the sparing of the life for the life that they had taken. Ladies and gentlemen, we've seen Virginia get it wrong. Earl Washington, 9 days before he was supposed to be executed, he's exonerated. Cost this Commonwealth millions of dollars, paying him in compensation for the liberty that we took from him. Keith Allen Harward, my friend, 33 years, barely escaped the death penalty. 33 years of freedom lost because the government got it wrong. That's why I support the abolition of the death penalty. One of the reasons, besides my faith. But what you've left us with is where the government can get it wrong again. The government can get it wrong when somebody abducts a child with the intent to defile and kills and murders that child, and a judge says 30 years. And they'll be out with good behavior and good time credits and all the other stuff we've done. You'll have a chance at freedom when that child doesn't have a chance at life. If you're going to abolish the death penalty, Mr. President, I urge this body to make the punishment simple. That if you're convicted of aggravated murder, then it is death. It is not death. It is life without the possibility of parole. And so, Mr. President, my name is on this bill, but I cannot vote for it. Thank you, Mr. President.
What purpose is Senator from Northern Fairfax? Senator Howe rise.
Speaking to the bill, Mr. President.
Senator, has the floor.
I was afraid this was going to happen. I was really afraid that I would have to speak after the senator from Franklin. There is nobody as articulate as him in my whole life. But here I am. I'm after the senator from Franklin. I want to give a slightly different perspective on this bill. When I arrived here in 1992, I was a fervent supporter of the death penalty. Vengeance is mine, I thought. Vengeance is ours in the legislature, I thought. And one of the main reasons I supported it was I had sympathy and empathy for victims' families. Well, something dreadful happened in my family. My father-in-law was murdered in his own home by a burglar. And as I'm sure you can imagine, that tore us apart then, and it still has a huge hole in our hearts. And some of us in the family will never get over it. We'll never get over it. But one thing I discovered as we went through this trauma was my family didn't agree on the death penalty. Some of us supported it, some of us didn't. I think my husband would have given the worst torture imaginable to the murderer, but my sons didn't believe in the death penalty. And I was trying to hold my family together in a very difficult time. So I don't buy the idea that we would support the death penalty for the benefit of victims' families. It doesn't work that way. Trust me, it doesn't work that way. So I am going to vote for this bill. I would urge everybody else to, and if you're thinking about the victims' families, think really deeply, because it's a very complicated situation. Thank you.
Thank the senator. For what purpose is the senior senator from Chesapeake, Senator Cosgrove, rise?
Speak to the bill, Mr. President.
Senator's the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. In the late 1800s, Benjamin Disraeli was quoted as saying, "There are three types of lies. There's damned lies, and there's statistics." We've heard a lot of statistics today. One comparing Virginia and its history to Texas and its history. Well, there's a statistic. What was left out was the statistic that Virginia is 236 years older than the state of Texas. The other things that we've been talking about are the costs involved of maintaining these prisoners for the rest of their natural life. Housing, medical expenses, clothing, food, utilities, you name it, for the rest of their natural life. And you know what's even worse than that? Is that the families of those people they brutally murdered are paying the taxes to pay for that. What kind of closure is that for a Virginia family? Especially for the heinous type of murder that happened right down here in Carytown. 2 adults, 2 children, brutally beaten to death over several days in their own basement. Let's let their families pay the taxes so those people can stay healthy and warm and fed and clothed. The other thing is we talk about there's a poll for this and there's a poll for that. What we never hear when somebody says there's a poll or there's a study is what the actual question was. If the actual question in the Wasson poll was, do you support the death penalty or don't you? I'd like to know if that was the question. Because easily probably somebody would say, well, I'd rather not. But if you also said, do you support the death penalty for somebody that beat 2 children, a 4-year-old and a 9-year-old, over several days to death in their own home, should they get the death penalty? I bet you'd get a different statistic. And I will echo the comments from the senator from Franklin. There was an opportunity here to make this bill better. There was an opportunity here to get a number of votes from this side of the aisle. But that just could not be tolerated. We had to make sure that this type of heinous murder still had a chance to get out on parole. And we know the kind of people that have been getting out of parole here lately. So if you really think that the best idea, you go back and tell your constituents that you think that's the best idea. I bet a lot of them will disagree with you. Thank you, Mr. President.
For what purpose is the junior senator from Richmond City, Senator Morrissey, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, speaking on behalf and in support of SB 1165.
Senator's the floor.
Mr. President, one of the greatest pleasures or joys that I, and I think many of my colleagues have in this body, is serving with a group of 39 other individuals that come to this body with such a vast array of life experiences. And they bring those experiences into the body, they share them with others during debate. The senator from James City County said yesterday that he has perhaps defended more murder defendants than anybody in the body. I don't know, that may be true. I think I am the only person who has prosecuted people for death penalty cases and defended them. And in my early 30s, when I was the Commonwealth Attorney in the city, and I knew everything. I knew absolutely everything. I probably prosecuted 60 or 70 murders by the time I was 35. And I remember having a discussion with my mother, and like we all feel about our mothers, they were saints. And my mother asked me about one case when I was successfully prosecuted a murder case. I was so proud that I had gotten that conviction because it was a horrible murder. And then she asked me to, she listened, and she said, you think about that, and we'll talk about that later. She passed before we ever got to talk about it. And then later, I did more and more cases. I visited death row, not to witness an execution, but to visit death row, to see for myself what went on. And then I defended cases. And I remember after that, I came to the absolute conclusion that the death penalty was wrong. And I'm going to tell you the reasons why I feel that. And I actually believe that it's possible to turn some of the hearts of the folks that have spoken here today, who have spoken eloquently. And I'm not going to say you're wrong. I'm just asking you for a few minutes to open your heart and just listen to the argument. First of all, if we talk about person after person, the most horrible, brutal murder you've ever seen, we won't resolve this debate. Because I'm here to tell you, having done over 125 murders, they are horrible. They are the worst of the worst. There's no question about it. But here is one absolute certitude. We've heard different numbers. It's not a statistic, it's a fact. Since 1973, there have been exactly 174 people who were sentenced to death and then were exonerated. Now, let me tell you what that means by they were sentenced to death. That means a prosecutor deliberated, decided what to bring, what charge to bring, and decided to bring capital murder. And he did. And a jury returned a verdict of death. And it was appealed to appellate court. It was appealed to a state Supreme Court, first level. Then the second level, they went through it again, state habeas. Then they went through a third level, federal habeas. And that person then was sentenced to death. But guess what? In 174 cases, many decided by DNA, the prosecutor came forward and said, we got it wrong. And that was because of DNA evidence. So we've heard before that the death penalty, that execution is the ultimate irrevocable punishment. But let me tell you this. Consider this. Those were 174 people who empirical evidence, scientific evidence, were able to show innocent. But there's more. You know what you can't measure? No amount of scientific testing, empirical evidence, will get a false identification. Do you know the single greatest reason for misverdicts, false verdicts in this country? Not DNA, it's a false identification. So consider this. We've heard about Earl Washington, and everybody loves to say he came within 9 days of being put to death. But do you know what else? Earl Washington was intellectually disabled. Did you know that Earl Washington confessed to the murder? He confessed, I did it. So put together a horrible, heinous murder, together with the fact that the defendant confesses it, and you've got what all of my colleagues have said today, you've got an absolute, airtight, solid case warning death. But it was wrong. And you can't measure that coerced confession with DNA. Let me tell you another one. Michael McAllister. I prosecuted him for a rape in South Richmond, and it was airtight. It was a rape. It was a bad rape. And the person who committed this rape raped an aspiring model and artist. And when we put her on, she looked across the table and she said, that's the person that did it. And when the police, she was raped in her apartment laundry room. And at the time, there was a series of rapes going on, and the person had a beard, and he was always wearing this plaid shirt. And when she got on the witness stand, she looked to that jury, and she answered my question, and she said, the person that did it is right there. And the defense attorney said, how do you know? And she said, because she was a model, she says, I focused on bone structure. She was an artist, and those features that she described and what she described in the report were spot on. Convicted of rape, it wasn't a murder case, goes to prison. Charlie Martin was the defense attorney. I go to Ireland, and I'm going to school and teaching at Trinity College, and we find out a few years later that at that exact time, there was that exact night, another detective division were surveilling these apartments because of a rapist that also, wearing plaid shirts, had a beard. They arrested him. And then finally, Charlie Martin and that other detective got together. It was, to say it was a mind-blowing moment would not do justice. The two people not only could have been brothers, identical brothers. And when they arrested Michael McAllister, do you know what the police did? They said, well, we just want to take a picture of you to show the victim. And he said, well, I was here watching TV with my mom. They said, well, would you put this plaid shirt on? Because that's what the person had, and he did it, and they showed that picture to the victim. And then when we found out, several years later, that the police were at that same time, in that same neighborhood, surveilling others for rapists, it was horrible. Charlie Martin came back. I returned from Europe to go before the parole board, and I said, had I known this information at the time, I never would have prosecuted it. But I'm telling you, folks, it was a solid case. Now, if that person had murdered in the commission of rape, that would have been a death penalty. And that would have been one of the cases that my colleague from Rockingham County or Chesapeake would have said is the worst of the worst. So my point is, it's not 174 cases where the prosecutor came forward since 1973 and said, we got it wrong. But think of those other cases where false identification, or in the case of Earl Washington, coerced confession, led to an improper conviction. Number two, the gentleman from James City County said it best yesterday. He said, people say death penalty is warranted because it deters crime. He said, no, it doesn't, and I can tell you it does not. Third, the death penalty is often used within a skewed judicial system. That is just a fact. Now, many people have inadequate legal representation, but I want to just emphasize something that the gentleman from Eastern Fairfax said. When you pick a jury in a death sentence case, you know what they call that jury? Death qualified. You pick a death qualified jury. That means 40 veneer men are in the panel, and they're asked, do you support the death penalty or do you not? And when they say, and they'll say, I just can't support the death penalty, boom, they're off. I can't impose the death penalty or I can't support the death penalty. You get a death qualified jury. You get the most conservative jury that you can imagine that is going to decide death or life. So it is skewed. And then fourth, it is discriminatory. It is absolutely certain by those that have done studies on it, that those folks in less advantaged socioeconomic backgrounds, due to rather racial, ethnic, or religious minorities, that they are discriminated against. And I'm going to prove to you that this is the case. The gentleman from Eastern Fairfax said, well, we haven't had a death penalty case in conviction in 11 years. Folks, if you think justice is equal across the board, you're wrong. We have 4 regional capital defender offices of the Indigent Defense Commission in the state. And in the last 5 years, they've done between 40 and 50 capital murder cases. All right? Not one person has been sentenced to death. A senior capital office defender was asked why. And this is what he said. He said, rich people charged with murder get a rich person's defense. Poor people charged with murder do not. They're the ones that are convicted. And let me tell you this, with the regional capital defender offices of the Indigent Defense Commission, the poor people get rich defenses because all they do is focus on capital murder cases. That's why in the last 5 years, of the 50 cases they've done, there hasn't been one death penalty verdict. So there is no question that is discriminatory. And then I appreciated listening to the comments from the junior senator from Virginia Beach and the senator from Franklin County about pro-life. And I'm going to echo what Senator Stanley said yesterday. You can't be inconsistent. You are either pro-life or you are not. And you can't say, in my opinion, that if I'm pro-life, I am going to default or go the other direction when it comes to murder. The junior senator from Virginia Beach said, I believe in the sanctity of life from conception to natural death. Sending 1,000 volts of electricity through somebody's body is not a natural death. And if you believe, like I've just shown you, that we've gotten it wrong, it isn't 174 times. If there are false identifications and if there are coerced confessions, then that number is much higher than that. We get it wrong. And the gentleman from King George, who I just enjoy immensely listening to his arguments because they are logical, they are coherent. He said, I would rather one guilty person go free than in his 1 out of 10 scenario. Well, what's the number that we used? Is 174 too much? Because it's probably much higher than that for the reasons I just said. What is the collateral damage that we're willing to say that's acceptable? We can kill those many innocent people, and they were innocent. That's collateral damage. I don't think that number's there. So if you agree in the sanctity of life from the beginning to the end, then my friends on the other side of the aisle that profess and proclaim and at every opportunity, and rightfully so, talk about the sanctity of life, you can't default today. You can't default. You can't tell me, but that was the worst case. Because I can tell you, those worst cases, you get it wrong. So for those reasons, oh, by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't tell you the end of Michael McAllister. I came back from Europe, I went to the parole board, and I said to them, we got it wrong. Had I known this, never would have prosecuted this case. He was later subsequently pardoned, got out of jail after serving, I want to say it was close to 20 years in jail for a rape he didn't commit. And 2 years after he got out of jail, he passed. Folks, we get it wrong. This bill will never let that happen. I ask you, my friends on both sides of the aisle, to open your hearts and vote to support 1165. Thank you very much.
Thank the senator. For what purpose does the senior senator from Richmond City, Senator McClellan, rise?
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator has the floor.
Mr. President, I wasn't planning to speak on this bill today, but I feel compelled to bring the perspective of someone who can't share it himself, and that's Jerry Givens. He was the executioner in Virginia for I think it was 17 years. Some of us on the Judiciary Committee heard him testify against bills that would have expanded the death penalty. Jerry couldn't testify this year because he died of COVID in 2020. And as we've been sitting here, I have heard the words of Jerry Givens over and over and over in my mind as I've tried to listen to everyone else. Jerry Givens executed 62 people. His routine never wavered. He would shave the person's head. He would lay his hand on the bald head and ask for God's forgiveness for the condemned, because he didn't believe that anybody was beyond redemption. He would strap that person into the electric chair and flip the switch. And then he was the one that gave the lethal injection, which was much more intimate. It left him shaken. What was a pivotal moment for him, 3, as he said, was when he almost executed Earl Washington. And he realized the toll it would have taken on him had he executed an innocent man. And he started to think about how many innocent men had he executed. And then Jerry himself ended up in prison for embezzlement and saw firsthand how sometimes the criminal justice system fails you. And he said that another pivotal moment came one day when he was walking around the prison track where he would often talk to God. And he said God asked him a thorny question. Would you have executed your son if he were on death row? God asked, would you have executed my son if he were on death row? And Gibbons said he could only reply no, because Jesus was the Son of God. And he said he realized what he had done as executioner was not compatible with Jesus' teachings of forgiveness, that he could no longer support the death penalty, and that God told him to share his story, which he did for several years, including here. And one of the final things he said, I think, is appropriate as we decide how to vote today. Jerry said, I wasn't just for the death penalty. I was the one who carried it out. So you cannot say that I am not sincere. Those of you who want the death penalty, I carried it out for you. But it took 62 executions for me to see this wasn't the right thing to do. But Virginia is still doing the same thing. This is not the solution for our problem. Listen to me, because I did it. I'm listening to Jerry Givens today, and that's why I'm voting for this bill.
Thank the senator. Do any senators other than the patron wish to be heard regarding Senate Bill 1165? Seeing none, call the senator from Eastern Fairfax, Senator Surovell.
Mr. President, Tommy Norman.
Sorry. Thank you, Senator Norman. Senator from James City County, Senator Norman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Even from afar and through Zoom, I really have been attentive, moved, and impressed with the articulate arguments that have been presented here today. And I'm not advocating today one position or another, because I think I stated it pretty unequivocally yesterday, and I will not go on for an extended period of time. Yesterday, I mentioned that I brought my life experiences to this issue, and I must have misspoken a second time, because I did not suggest I had tried more murder cases than the junior senator from Richmond may have done. I said at the time I came to the General Assembly, I had tried more capital murder cases than any defense lawyer in Virginia. I've listened today, and I think that there has been a lot of individual legislators' catharsis, and that is not a criticism at all. There are those who oppose the death penalty for moral reasons. There are those who oppose it from emotional reasons. There are those who oppose it because there is certain information from advocacy groups who have a predisposed disposition, which is fine. But I just would like to call the body's attention, because I know that there are, all of us like to know what the objective, and as the junior senator from Richmond said, the empirical information in the Commonwealth of Virginia, not on a national basis. And I would suggest at the end of today, I am mindful that all of this eloquence and articulation isn't changing one vote, but that is all right. That's what the parliamentary debate process is all about. I would say tonight, if you have a moment of pausing and are interested in some objective empirical data in the Commonwealth of Virginia, go to the JLARC report, which was titled Review of Virginia System of Capital Punishment, and just read the summary on Roman numeral page 4. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Thank the senator. Call the senator from Eastern Fairfax, Senator Surovell.
Thank you, Mr. President. Speaking to the bill.
Senator's the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the debate on this. As I said yesterday, I'm sure everybody has very strong opinions about this, and I think a lot of people's opinions have probably evolved as they've served in the legislature over how many years you've served. I just want to clean up a couple points, and then I'll tell another story. First of all, I didn't realize my polling assertion was going to get so many questions. But first of all, I went and looked up the Wasson poll question. The Wasson poll question, which came out yesterday, question number 10, asked to random sample Virginians, Would you support or oppose a proposal to repeal the death penalty in the state of Virginia and replace it with a life sentence without parole? 56% support, 44% oppose. Question that was asked. Gallup poll. Gallup, they asked, are you in favor of the death penalty for a person convicted of murder? 55% yes, 43% no. But they also asked a separate Gallup poll where they asked people whether the death sentence was better than life in prison, and I think it was 60% of people surveyed said they supported life in prison over the death penalty. That was what the polling data reflected. I would also just note, by the way, that 55% of Virginians also support the repeal of mandatory minimum sentences in the same poll. Second thing, there's no question that the application, that the actual imposition of the death penalty has been rare in the last 10 years, but the incidence of our Commonwealth attorneys using it to prosecute and or leverage folks has not been rare. The data the Sentencing Commission gave me yesterday said that between FY15 and FY20, 61 people were charged with capital murder in Virginia. Out of the 61, 48 of them received life sentences, life without parole, and 13 of them got a term of years. And I can't tell you, based on the data I got, whether that was pursuant to a jury decision or a judge or a combination of the two or a plea or a trial, but that's the reality. So even though a lot of people aren't getting the death penalty, it is being used, leveraged, and attempted to be applied in order to either gain pleas or taken to trial. So it's still being used plenty, which is why our Capital Defender Service is really busy. So I don't think that it's quite that rare in terms of being attempted to be used. Third thing, I'm really impressed with a lot of people here have the senator from Northern Fairfax, or Western, Senator Howell. She stole my thunder on victims. The junior senator from Richmond stole some of my arguments on Earl Washington. Senator McClellan tapped Jerry Givens for me. The senator from Western Fairfax tapped some stuff I was going to say. Just, if you got a minute, go Google Daniel Williams, Joseph Dick, Eric Wilson, and Derek Tice, the Norfolk Four. They were charged with capital murder. We ended up paying about $10 million of taxpayer dollars because of that. And I believe some of them, if not all of them, confessed. And they ended up pleading guilty to avoid a capital murder trial. And none of them did it. They were all exonerated by DNA. It was a crooked detective, literally a crooked detective, that forced them to plead guilty. There's lots of names to look at. And in all the talk in opposition, I still have not heard anybody explain how it is moral to convict innocent people. The junior senator from Richmond was very eloquent in his speech, but I've not heard a single person explain how it is moral for our society to justify executing innocent people in order to have a system that provides some semblance of justice for some victims, but not all of them. I'm still waiting to hear what that argument is. Mr. President, the last thing I'd say is, one of the moments that I sort of achieved clarity on this issue was when I was about 21 years old. And I was at JMU, it was my senior year. President Carrier somehow got word to me. We didn't have email or text messages back then. I was told to go see President Carrier. He asked me to come see him, and he said, Surovell, I want you to apply to be a governor's fellow. I didn't know what that was, but I ended up applying for it. Came down here to Richmond for 2 months, and while we were here, we took all these field trips. And they took us to Falls Cape State Park. They took us to the ABC Warehouse. We went to the Supreme Court. We had this brand new museum of frontier culture. It was brand new back then. We took a field trip out there. And as they were showing us all the assets of our state, one of the things they decided it was important for us to go see was the brand new Greenville State Penitentiary. Because they thought it was important to give, some of, I guess, young leaders or young graduates from our Virginia colleges a tour of the death chamber. They gave the men one set of instructions. They told us to wear tennis shoes because the shoes that I'm wearing right now don't work very well in a prison when you're walking around on metal grates. They told all the women, don't wear a dress because you can look right up through the floor. And we walked around. They gave us a tour of the geriatric ward. They wouldn't dare take us where there were any younger prisoners. They took us a tour of the geriatric ward where all these old men were not doing a whole lot. And then they took us down the hall. And that was the first time I met Jerry Gibbons. And he walked us around, took us in the control booth. He showed us the machine where you push the buttons and explain. They all go in there, and a bunch of them get in there, and they don't know which button's going to do it, and they all hit the button. And then they took us out into the room, and there it stood was this wooden chair, because this is before lethal injection. And I didn't want to get anywhere near that thing. Some of the young idiots with me decided they wanted to sit in it. I didn't want to get anywhere near that thing. I just sat there and looked at it, and all I could think of was, you know, how many people have sat in that thing while the Commonwealth of Virginia, you know, cooked the life out of them. If you want to read some interesting stuff, go read about the electric chair. I put in a bill in to ban it back in 2014. And, you know, looking back on all that, I just sit there and wonder, like, how in the world could the people who put together that field trip program think that, you know, this is something we need to show our governor's fellows? You know, why is this something we're proud of? We got to go show them the electric chair. To me, it's twisted. And God, I hope they're still not taking the governor's fellows and showing them the lethal injection table. Mr. President, I think at the end of the day, if we look back 50 years from now, the electric chair, that lethal injection table, they're going to be sitting in a museum. They're going to be sitting next to the stocks from Jamestown and Williamsburg. They're going to be sitting next to the slave auctioneer block that they're taking off the streets in Fredericksburg just recently. This thing's going to be a museum piece, and people are going to look back and wonder how it was we ever used these things. Mr. President, it's time to move on. I hope you support the bill.
Do any other senators wish to be heard? Seeing none, the question is, shall Senate Bill 1165 pass? All in favor of the motion will record their vote aye. Those opposed, no. Are the senators ready to vote? Have all the senators voted? Do any senators desire to change their vote?
Senator Norman, how do you vote?
Senator Norman votes no.
Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 21, no 17.
Ayes 21, no 17. Senate Bill 1165 passes.